What is art? An expression whose goal is to communicate on an aesthetic rather than practical level. One of the things that I want you to make sure you understand is that just because it does not achieve its goal does not mean that it is not art. It says an expression whose goal is to communicate. So that means if the goal is to communicate, that doesn't mean that it always achieves that, like I just said. So anyway, a lot of times when we encounter an artwork, we have the attitude that if it isn't communicating directly to us, then it isn't art, or we have the right to judge it. But if that person that created it intended it to communicate, it has a goal to communicate, then it's, at least in that area, it fulfills our definition of what is art. Then it talks about to communicate on an aesthetic rather than practical level, and we'll see some more about that as we go along. Communication. Successful communication. Notice it says successful communication requires three things, and you might remember these from other classes that you've had. A sender or a source, a medium or a message, and a receiver that is tuned into the medium. Yo puedo hablar en español y si usted no entiende español, no va a entender lo que estoy diciendo. I don't know whether you understand Spanish or not, but I was a sender. I had a message, but you as a receiver may or may not have been tuned in to the medium. So in other words, successful communication would not have taken place if you're not able to understand or you're not tuned in to the language of the medium. And we'll see more and more about that as we go on, because whenever you're dealing with art, you're dealing with culture. And whenever you're dealing with culture, you're dealing with a certain set of experiences and backgrounds that someone from one culture may have that someone from another culture may not. Aesthetic. Well, here you have a dictionary definition of aesthetic. You have pertaining to a sense of the beautiful or the science of aesthetics. One of the reasons that I don't like to use the word beauty or beautiful is because now you're getting into subjectivity, and who's to say what one person considers beautiful as opposed to somebody else. The definition that we're really going to deal with is the one that's highlighted there: pertaining to, involving, or concerned with pure emotion and sensation as opposed to pure intellectuality. And understand that that sensation, any set of stimuli, any reaction that you have to something on an intangible or on a subjective plane, as opposed to pure intellectuality or practicality. If I have an object in front of you and it has four legs, a place for your behind and a place for your back, I think that everybody would agree that it is a chair. That's intellectuality. That's practicality. But is it a beautiful chair? Is it a comfortable chair? All these things are pertaining to, involving, or are concerned with pure emotion and sensation. And so that's what we're referring to when we talk about aesthetic. All right, we're going to get into a little bit of terminology here. We've got consonant on one side and dissonant on the other. Consonant refers to those things that are relatively easy on the senses. You look at some pictures here where you recognize the pictures. There's nothing harsh about them. Even as we compare the two, you might find the one that's in color to be a little bit harsher on the senses because it's a little bit more angular and less realistic than the other picture, even though the other picture is not in color. And so that's kind of interesting in itself, the fact that you're looking at a picture and the more realistic one does not contain color, yet when we see things, we see them in color. Okay, if you look at, especially if you look at the eyes of the one on the right as you're looking at it, the curly-haired person, the eyes are very, very realistic. The shadow, everything, the skin tone, everything looks very realistic compared to the other one. But we're not really talking about realism at the moment. We're talking about more about whether it's easy or harsh on the senses. Now we're going to look at a couple of more faces. Dissonant is relatively harsh on the senses. And if you look at these two portraits, because all four of the paintings that you're looking at are portraits, all four of the artworks are portraits, you find that the ones under dissonant are a bit harsher on the senses, especially the one that is more disfigured and disproportionate, for lack of a better term at the moment. Okay? So that's consonant versus dissonant. You can, of course, always come back and look at this at your own leisure if you so desire. A couple of more terms: tension versus release. Tension is a feeling of relative instability. If you look at the cone on the floor there, it looks like it's about to fall over. All right, so that's a feeling of relative instability. Release is a feeling of relative stability. And as you can see, the cone sitting flat on its base, it gives you a feeling of relative stability. Now, the interesting thing is, it's the exact same cone. All I did was invert the picture, and I changed what it was sitting on to change whether you felt like you had a feeling of instability or stability. And of course, the other thing is this: even though both of the images seem to be in 3 dimensions or three-dimensional, they're actually 2-dimensional because you're looking at them on your computer screen. So all they have is they have height and they have width. They really don't have depth, but because we played with perspective and used shadow and things of that nature, and an artist uses all of those things to give you that feeling of stability, instability, that feeling of easy on the senses, harsh on the senses, etc. Here's something that you'll need to look at: the baby scene or the step scene from the movie Untouchables. As it says, shows how tension and release can be used. Both the subject matter and the techniques combined for an extremely tense scene. And there's your URL where you can find it on YouTube, or you could search Untouchables. The one that I have there is a very clear, large image. It's not in English, but that's really not important. You may even have the movie at home, but check that out. All right, a couple more terms: concrete versus abstract. Concrete is relatively easy to associate with prior perceptions and or experiences, whereas abstract is not relatively easy to associate with prior perceptions and or experiences. Sometimes people tend to think of, when we think of English, we think of concrete as far as something that is tangible, and abstract is something that is intangible. Well, in the arts, those terms don't really apply as easily, and so that's why we talk about it as far as whether you can associate it with something that you're familiar with or not associate it with something that you're familiar with. If you look at this, is this concrete or is it abstract? It's going to go through a few changes here. So now, looking at this image, these 2 curves on the top and the other curve on the side, depending on what your frame of reference is and what you read into it or what you see into it, you may have seen any of the images that I superimposed there, or you might see something else. Okay, so concrete or abstract, is it easy to associate with something in your experience, or is it not easy to associate? That's concrete versus abstract. Simple versus complex. Something simple has relatively few contrasting components, or is relatively easy to discern the components and their relationship to each other. Now, of course, right now we're using visual things. And there you have complex, having relatively more contrasting components, or relatively difficult to discern the components and their relationship to each other. So, again, a lot of this is going to be based on your frame of reference. If you're used to something, if you are a cook and you taste somebody's recipe, you'll be able to discern all the different ingredients and the different seasonings that somebody used, where somebody that is not that well versed wouldn't be able to see it all. Okay, so simple versus complex, all of these things are relative. If you notice, the term relative is in just about every definition that we've used so far. So simple, having relatively few contrasting components, or relatively easy to discern the components and their relationship to each other, and complex is the opposite. There's a couple of audio examples you can listen to here on YouTube. The Blue Danube Waltz, and then Bach Inventions. You'll notice that the Blue Danube uses an entire orchestra, yet sounds more simple than the Bach Inventions that are just one solo player at the piano. And again, what artists do, what we do is we manipulate the elements that we have on hand, and we try to interface that with what we feel like your perceptions as the recipient of that art, your perceptions and your frame of reference is, and we use that to try and get that intellectual and or emotional stimuli. That's basically my purpose as an artist in presenting art to you, the recipient, is to stimulate you either intellectually and or emotionally. Another couple of terms: motion, having a relative feeling of motion, and static, not having a relative feeling of motion. Okay? Now, if I had shown you the curved line on the right at first without any other frame of reference, you might have gotten a feeling of motion from it. Gentle motion, albeit, but you still might have gotten a feeling of motion. But when compared to the one on the left, you definitely can see where one has relatively more motion and the other one has relatively less motion. Again, an emphasis on that term relative, because you just don't know what somebody's frame of reference is, or whether they're going to see it as this or that. You can get with this or you can get with that. Yeah. Static. A lot of times when we think of static, we think of a lot of motion because we think of that white noise, pink noise, whatever you want to call it, thing that happens on TV or on a radio station when you're not quite tuned in. But static literally means having no motion, being at rest, fixed or stationary, okay, and all the things that you see there. All right.